You are listening to I Survived the Wild Outdoors podcast, where real outdoorsmen and women share their heroic tales of survival. I'm your host, Brad Mathewson, and this is their story. Hello, everyone. My guest today hails from British Columbia. I'm honored to talk with Stephan Kesting, a firefighter, outdoorsman, writer, and skilled canoeist. Stephan's journey took an incredible turn when he faced a life-saving kidney transplant. Yet, despite the odds, he not only survived, but thrived. Just a year after his transplant, he embarked on a 42-day, 1,000-mile solo canoe trip through the wilds of the Canadian Subarctic. Along the way, he faced relentless challenges, dodging wild bears, navigating through forest fires, and battling fierce storms, all while pushing his physical and mental limits. He's now written a book about that unbelievable adventure called Perserverance, Life and Death in the Subarctic, where he recounts the harrowing experiences and life-changing lessons he learned along the way. Hello, Stephan. Thank you for coming to share your story with us today.
So my name is Stephan Kesting, and in 2019, I ended up doing a 1,000-mile solo trip through the Canadian North. I started in Saskatchewan, in the northern boreal forest of Saskatchewan. I went downriver and upriver, crossed into northern Manitoba. From there, I went north and crossed over the tree line and the Manitoba-Nunavut border, out onto the tundra, and then down by myself to Hudson Bay. So that was 1,000 miles. It was 42 days in the wilderness. I didn't see anyone for the last 25 days, I believe. And so it was very remote. It's one of the hardest things I've ever done. And when people hear this, the very first thing they say is like, why did you do that alone? And for me, I guess, going into the wilderness has always been the place where I've gone to process difficult things. In my 20s, I'm now in my 50s, but in my 20s, I spent an awful lot of time in the wilderness alone. And when one of my brothers died tragically in a motorcycle accident, what did I do? I went into the wilderness. I went into the wilderness and ended up doing a really long solo canoe trip a little bit further south in southern Canada. But it was a long time alone. And what that did is it allowed the emotions to process. It initially, after my brother's death, I didn't cry. I didn't cry at all, not for 9 months. I just held it together. I had to keep things together. And I was just kind of lost. I was just wandering from job to job. I went from Montreal to Toronto and just picking up odd jobs, living in, at one point, a flop house. And once, to provide a break from the monotonous job I was doing, was bicycle couriering. It was a really slow day. I took myself out of service and I went into the University of Toronto map library. I love looking at maps and I love playing connect the dots. And then I got in there and I started looking at maps to the north and trips I'd heard about. I started connecting the dots, and I didn't have the money to charter a float plane to fly into these places. So I'd have to get there by boat. I'd have to canoe to get to the start of the canoe trip. But now that's difficult to get to. So I'd have to canoe to get to the beginning of the trip, to do the trip, to get to the beginning of the trip. And it ended up being a long time alone in the bush. This is in my 20s, like I said. And I remember heading off. And after about a week of being alone in the bush, paddling down the Athabasca River, I was just paddling along, looking for the next place to stop, paying attention to the current. And it felt like I got clubbed across the back of the head by a baseball bat, because the grief that I'd been holding in for almost a year just suddenly came welling to the surface. And there I was on the river, bawling my face off, just crying for the first time. And then for the next couple of weeks, that grief would fade, and then it would come back, it would fade, it would come back. And by the end of that trip, I pretty much processed it. I mean, you never really get over the sadness, but that kind of paralyzing grief that holds you and makes your heart feel like it's in a vice, that had faded. And I'd come to terms with things like the anger at my brother, because it was his fault that he died. He did something stupid. He went out on a dirt bike in the middle of a country road in the middle of the night, and got hit by a car that couldn't see that he was coming. His fault. And there was initially a whole lot of anger that I hadn't even realized. Like, how can you do this to me? How can you do this to your family? But being out in a boat, being out paddling by myself, having my monkey mind occupied by, oh, I should go left here, I should go right here, watch out for those clouds, that could turn into a thunderstorm. Is that a rapid there? Watch out for this eddy. Is that a log poking up out of the water? What about bears? It kind of occupied the monkey, the procedural part of my mind. And my body was occupied by paddling. I was taking many, many strokes a day. And that freed up something deeper. It freed up that kind of emotional churning, that deeper thought that was processing down there as a subroutine. And so that was an example of using the wilderness as a place to heal, as a place essentially to deal with death. Since that time, another brother of mine died, and again, I retreated to the wilderness to try and deal with that. I had my grandmother pass away right in front of me. I watched my mother die gradually of ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, and going from being a vibrant person to somebody who was just a shell of herself, trapped inside a mind that worked, trapped inside a body that didn't. That was tragic. And I also work as a firefighter, and I've witnessed hundreds of deaths. And some of them were traumatic, and some of them weren't. And some of them were old, and some of them were young. But still, it creates this reservoir of stuff to deal with. And for me, the place I deal with that, and the place where I retreat to make the hard decisions in life, has always been the outdoors. So that's the background. The outdoors has been entwined with my dealing with the inevitable trauma of life, right? If you live, people around you are going to die. And it's, as a side note, it's not necessarily a bad thing. If somebody dies, it's tragic. So it's not necessarily purely a bad thing. If somebody that you know or somebody you've encountered dies, that's tragic, but they're also giving you a reminder. They're giving you a reminder that life is short. It's the ultimate memento mori. Remember that you are going to die. And so if there's something really important that you want to do, if there's something that you won't feel fulfilled without having done, let it go and do it, because death is coming for us all. And for some of us, it could be a lot earlier than we think. Again, I've been a firefighter. I've seen young people with terrible forms of cancer. I've seen people with young children in terrible car accidents. It can come at a moment's notice, and you don't necessarily know when it's coming. So that's the background. In early 2010-ish or thereabouts, I found out that I was dying. And I hadn't really done a whole lot of outdoor stuff in the intervening time between my 20s and my early 50s. I had been embroiled in raising kids, in working, and doing a couple of jobs, going through a divorce, all the usual stuff of parenting in the modern era. And, working as hard as I could to try and keep the boat afloat. So yeah, I would still go out and do little paddling trips, day trips, or a week here, a week there, a weekend backpacking trip, but nothing big. And that's just the nature of things. And it's not something I'm bitter about, because that is the nature of life. But I got diagnosed with this polycystic kidney disease, which meant that my kidneys were gradually shutting down. And there were things you can do to maybe slow it down a little bit, but nothing really worked. And as the years went on, I watched that kidney function just tick down and down and down. And eventually, my nephrologist, my kidney doctor, said the words that I kind of knew were coming, but man, they're a shock to hear out loud, which is, do you know anyone who can give you a kidney? And that really puts things into focus. It means like, hey, this random date at a random time in the future is a whole lot closer than you think. If you don't get a kidney, you're going to be on dialysis or you're going to die. So I did what I did not want to do. I asked my brother, can I have a kidney? And he said yes. And I'm forever grateful for that, because I would have 1,000 times rather given someone a kidney than asked for a kidney. There's a real dichotomy there. I just hated the idea of asking. As it turns out, a bunch of friends of mine had found out that I was dying and found out that I was being considered for a kidney transplant. They went and got tested on their own. Again, something that I'm incredibly grateful for in the long run, because that's above and beyond just regular friendship. And these people were willing to go under the knife and have surgery and give me something that's irreplaceable. So we went ahead with it. In 2015, I had a kidney transplant. In 2016, I had a double kidney removal. The old kidneys were just giving me a ton of trouble. There were a ton of infections and there was a ton of complications. And it was a long, difficult recovery. It really was. But it's useful when you're facing a long struggle to kind of have a light at the end of the tunnel, to visualize a light at the end of the tunnel. And I remember as I was being wheeled into surgery, one of the last thoughts that I had before going under was, I don't know if I'm ever going to become fully functional again. I don't know if I'll be able to go in the outdoors. I don't know if I'll be able to return to my job as a firefighter. I don't know if I'll be able to do jiu-jitsu, which is something I do a lot of, really enjoy. But hopefully, if everything goes right, I wonder if I can make that trip that I've been dreaming of for 25 years. And that trip was to an area in northern Manitoba, northern Saskatchewan, and Nunavut. It's known as the land of little sticks. And if people have ever read Farley Mowat, P.G. Downs, Oberholzer and McGee, I don't know how many people have read J.B. Terrell, but maybe somebody has, or Samuel Hearn, a lot of the early explorers of this area, they write about this area very eloquently. And it just, for some reason, I glommed onto wanting to visit this area and travel through it and do a trip. And also, to some extent, return to the glories of my youth, if you will, and kind of give a big middle finger to kidney failure and polycystic kidney disease. As it turns out, what I hadn't thought of at the time, but was absolutely true, is I'd always used the outdoors as a way of processing trauma and processing loss and mortality in other people. But part of the desire to get out there was to process the death and mortality, or the near death, and the reminder of mortality, of my own mortality. Death wasn't something that could happen to other people anymore. I'd been presented very up close and personal with something that could have ended my life, and would have ended my life 50 years ago, and would have ended my life 100 years ago, and would have ended my life 1,000 years ago. It's only through the miracle of modern medicine and to some extent pharmacology that I'm alive now. So that was one of my last thoughts, going under the knife, and it kept me going during the long and difficult recovery. The setbacks were really pretty stupendous. I mean, we're talking pretty bad infections. I got a flesh-eating disease infection at one point above the graft site for the kidney. That was awesome. UTIs, really bad UTIs, sepsis. It was a long struggle. But always when I wasn't in the middle of that, I was trying to maintain some kind of physical movement and walking and walking and walking, and then beginning to lift weights, and then you get cut back down again. Now you're lifting weights again and trying to do some cardio and doing a bit of jiu-jitsu, and then something else comes up. But you're always trying to get back to it, because what's the alternative? There is no alternative. You have to keep on trying. And I started thinking about what I need to do and the systems I would need to set up to go do this trip. This trip was kind of a placeholder for so many other things. What systems would I need to set up in my life? What systems would I need to set up in my relationships? What would I need to do with my kids? What would I need to do with my side business, which is I sell a lot of jiu-jitsu instructionals through a company called grapplearts.com. Some of your listeners may do jiu-jitsu. They may have seen me on the other half of my personality, which is the guy who teaches jiu-jitsu on YouTube and the guy who teaches jiu-jitsu on streaming videos and apps and all that stuff. So if I was going to disappear in the bush for 50 days, how would that business not die? And what would I need to do to keep that alive? And there are answers to all these things. They're not easy, but there are answers. It just takes work. So it took another 4 years after the transplant until I was in a position physically to be able to do a difficult trip, and until I was in a position sort of socially and relationship-wise, and with the business structures in place to do that trip. So I got engaged at Christmas time, the 6 months before I was to leave, and the plan was to get married after I came back in September. And we had the perfect venue. We had the perfect venue. It was at the University of British Columbia Botanical Gardens. It was going to be outside. It was going to be set up like the Midsummer Night's Dream from Shakespeare. It was perfect. And then we lost the venue. And the only other time we could get in there was the day before I was scheduled to leave on this trip. We could only get in there on June 30th, and on June 31st, I was supposed to take off. So I spoke to my bride-to-be and asked her, what should we do? Should I delay this trip? And she said, no, stick with the plan. Again, I'm eternally grateful to her for allowing me to head off. And at this point, usually when I'm talking to somebody, their first question is, how much insurance did you have on your ass? To my knowledge, none. And if there was insurance, I'm sorry to have disappointed her. But she did seem pretty happy when I came back, and now they're all disappointed. So that's letting the cat out of the bag that I did, in fact, survive the trip. So there, I've ruined the story, I guess. So I headed off. I first made my way to Missinippi, Saskatchewan, which is about an hour north of where the paved road ends in Saskatchewan. If people have ever been to southern Saskatchewan, they think of this very flat land, like, I don't know, Idaho, where there's nothing but flat fields and crops and an occasional river valley. Well, northern Saskatchewan is not at all like that. Northern Saskatchewan is the Canadian Shield. It looks like Minnesota. It looks like Ontario. It looks like Northern Ontario, rather, to be specific. And it's a very rugged land where there's tons of granitic outcrops. The Canadian Shield is some of the oldest rock on the planet. The land of spruce trees and jack pine and forest fires. And I headed off. And at first I went down the Churchill River. So the Churchill is this ancient trade route. It was used by the native peoples for thousands of years. It was used by the Hudson Bay Company to move furs out of the wilderness and down to Montreal to then go across the ocean and be shipped off to Paris and England to make hats or make fine stoles or whatever you make out of fur. And so that was a very historical route. It was a very interesting week or two that I spent on the Churchill River going downstream. And I did have a massive comeuppance on day one. So I do have this giant reservoir of experience in the outdoors. And I am very good at running whitewater. And I'm pretty good at sort of the craftsmanship of the outdoors. But it's rusty. It's like having a black belt and training really hard to get a black belt and being competitive and going to competitions and being on the top of your game, and then going into maintenance mode and only training once a week. You might keep most of your knowledge, but your skills are going to degrade. Your reaction time is going to degrade. So on day one, I was heading down the Churchill River. It was very, very wide at that point, a couple of miles across. And I was kind of in the middle of it. Very windy day, and I'd rigged a small sail to help pull me downwind. And while I was looking down to check my route on the map and had put down my paddle for a second, a gust of wind came, hit my sail, knocked the boat over, and there I was floating in the Churchill River. Ice cold water, 2 hours into the trip, everything just yard sailing across essentially a lake. It's a river, but at that part it's more like a lake. And that took a long time to undo. It took a couple of hours to get back to shore and get everything dried out and repacked. And it took a couple of weeks for me to get my confidence back. Because if I could screw up this badly, this early in the trip, and I'm a bloody expert. I've got my canoeing certification. I've been a guide. I've taught canoeing. I've taken people on other trips. I've done other long trips. And here I am, I completely screwed up right away. That's a difficult thing to come back from. So the mantra of the trip became no more mistakes. By which I don't mean don't make any mistakes ever, just don't make the big, serious, potentially trip-ending mistakes or life-ending mistakes. No serious mistakes. And it was a real comeuppance. And in the days to come, I would develop the routines and the sort of procedures to try and keep me safe and try and mitigate the risks, because I'm totally pro people taking risks, but I'm very anti people taking risks that have downstream effects on other people. So the classic example of that is smoking. I think you should be allowed to smoke. I think smoking should be your choice. But I also don't think that you should be allowed to smoke indoors in a restaurant, because now your choice and the consequences of your choice are affecting other people. And it's easy to say, go risk your life in the wilderness. But when you have kids, there is, I'm not out there doing a super dangerous thing with my kids, so they're going to survive. But I could deprive them of a father, and I could put them through a rather tremendous amount of trauma of losing one of their parents. And that wouldn't be good at all. So I really had to be continuously aware of balancing the risk and reward part of the equation and trying to err on the side of caution and try and take a look at every situation and figure out what's the credible worst case scenario here. If I continue with this, what's the worst thing that's likely to happen? If I cross this bay here and I'm out to sea for 3 kilometers, 2 miles, and I'm a mile from shore and that wind comes up, what could happen? And how do I mitigate that? How do I rig my canoe? What do I wear? What other steps do I take to minimize the odds of this really turning out terribly? At the end of the Churchill, not at the end of the Churchill River, at the end of my time on the Churchill River, the Churchill would continue on. I branched off and started going upriver. And I went up the Reindeer River, which is a medium-sized river, but it's still, you're going against the current. And the upriver was in flood. It was very high. It had been raining for weeks. So I had to fight my way up against the current. Some sections were large lake-like portions, and those were relatively easy to ascend other than the wind. And other portions were much swifter. So I either had to paddle as hard as I could for 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes and then rest, basically doing a series of sprints, or get out and just drag the damn boat up through the water, wading up to my knees, or sometimes using something that's called tracking, where you tie a rope to the front of the boat and a rope to the back of the boat, and you pull the boat up slightly angled out towards the middle of the river. So as you pull it up, the sideways pressure on the boat pulls it out into the current, keeps it from shore. And that's an art in itself. It's kind of fun, but it's also high risk, because now you've got one rope in one hand, a rope in the other. You could tangle yourself up in the rope. You're jumping from wet rock to wet rock. You could break an ankle. You could lose your boat. But it's one of the faster ways to travel upriver. So that was the second stage of the trip. There were 7 stages in all. The third stage was crossing Reindeer Lake. Now, crossing a lake might seem easy, but this lake is 250 kilometers long, or about 150 miles long. And it's really wide. It's 40 or 50 kilometers wide. So call that just under 30 miles, maybe. It's so wide that you can't see the other shore, because the curvature of the earth hides the far horizon. And there's like Lake Superior, like the Great Lakes. The shore is just absolutely blasted, and there's lots of amazing rock right on the shore. Why? I mean, plants would happily grow right down to the edge of the water, but it's because the giant storms on the lake just blast the shoreline with waves. So that's a good reminder that a storm can come up at any time, and they can come up real quick. They can come up in half an hour. It can go from calm to a thunderstorm or a squall so severe that you cannot continue at all. And then hopefully there's a place where you can land. Reindeer Lake was also, there were a couple of little communities on it. I passed 1, 2, 3, 4 tiny little native communities. The ones on Reindeer Lake were absolutely minuscule. It was like 500, 600 people in each of the community, and then a tiny community of 30 or 40 people. These were mostly Cree. Excuse me. So these are Cree. And Cree is a type of what we would have called them Indian a while ago. But it's the first of 3 big native demographics that I went through, or native groups. And if by this point, I was beginning to finally hit my stride. I'd overcome the beating. My confidence had taken an absolute beating on that first day in the first couple of hours, but I'm beginning to get my mojo back. I was beginning to figure out how to address these risks, how not to screw up, how to be on what alert stage I should be at given a certain set of threats. Should I be on yellow alert, red alert, or is now this a life and death struggle? And trying to avoid the life and death struggles and try and be in red alert as infrequently as possible, but you still have to modulate your risk and how hard you go. If you're going to say you're going to do a crossing, it's going to be a 2-mile crossing. A lot of stuff can go wrong in those 2 miles. So you time it. Maybe I'm going to do that very first thing in the morning, get up at 5 a.m. to do that first crossing, because usually, not always, but usually the winds are lower. That's tilting the odds a little bit in my favor. And you know what? I'm going to leave the sail down for this crossing because I don't want any extra thing to catch the wind. Even if it's going to help me, it just increases the chance of something going wrong. And now I'm going to paddle hell bent for leather. I'm going to give it my all. I'm not going to go at a pace I can sustain for 12 hours. I'm going to go at a pace I can sustain for 2 miles, and that's it. And then I'll rest at the far end because I want to cross across the danger zone as fast as possible. So that's kind of an example of how I was beginning to adapt my style of travel. And also, I found that from previous experience, after about a week in the woods, the experience really changes. It goes from being this weird thing that you're doing, this kind of, it's so strange to be eating over a campfire and to be pitching a tent, to it feeling completely normal. Of course, I'm going to wake up in a tent. Of course, I'm going to hang up my clothes on a tree branch to dry. Of course, I'm going to light a fire. So I'd made that switch, and now I was in the zone. It doesn't mean I didn't screw up, but I didn't screw up too badly, with one possible exception later on. So from Reindeer Lake, which is a gigantic lake, I went up the Cochrane River. Again, this was going upstream, and this started getting really difficult because the flavor of the river was different. The banks were higher, so the water was faster, and we're getting into slightly different ecosystems with tons of willows. And people think of willows, they think this big, maybe a weeping willow, this big, graceful tree. Well, that's not the kind of willow that you get in the northern boreal forest. You get willows that are shrubs, essentially. They might be 3 to 10 feet tall, and the branches stick out sideways for another 3 to 10 feet. And that's a problem when you're wading up a river right at the water's edge, waist deep in the water, freezing cold water, and now there's all these branches reaching out across the water for you. So that was an extremely difficult ascent. And I guess sort of the highlight of that was, or maybe the low light, was one evening I was going up, and I noticed that the sky was getting really red. And I told myself, don't worry, this is probably just forest fires from Alberta, far, far away, 1,000 miles away. It must be smoke that's high up in the atmosphere. Alberta usually gets big fires in the summer. And of course, getting bigger fires more often now that Alberta's heating up. As it turns out, I was wrong. It wasn't a big fire far away. It was a small to medium-sized fire, but it was really close. So when I got up the next morning, the smoke was just super thick. I could barely see a mile. I had to navigate across small lakes that formerly would have been real easy. Like, oh, that's where I need to go. But the mist, and it wasn't mist, it was smoke, but it appeared like a mist, was so thick that I had to use a compass even to go 500 yards just to be sure that I was going the right way. And eventually I figured out by triangulating where the smoke got thicker and where it got less thick, that this fire was probably about 10 to 15 miles ahead. It was actually roughly right on the river that I needed to ascend. And so I didn't know exactly what to do. Should I retreat back to the last native village? That would take about a week. It would lose me about a week of time. But maybe that's the right thing to do. Should I hunker down on a small island and wait for this fire to burn past me? That could be a right thing to do. in the end, I decided to go right for it because maybe I could get to a part of the river where the whole river hung a hard right turn up to the northwest. And maybe if I could get to that hook before the fire got to the hook, then I'd be safe. Then I could kind of matador the fire. And that turned into a 14-hour day of just gut-busting paddling and wading and portaging and going as fast as I humanly could. I really wanted to get to that hook before the fire did. As it turns out, I did. By the time I got to that place where I had to change direction, the skies looked like Mordor. There was ash falling out of the sky. It was pretty dark. So the fire was close, but it wasn't there yet. And then as soon as I matadored the fire, as soon as I did that right-hand turn, it started getting better. And I could still see couldn't see the flames behind me, but I could see the plume of black smoke. It looked like a nuclear bomb had gone off and was continuously going off. I could see that behind me, but the further I got, each paddle stroke took me a little bit further away from that. So that was probably the closest call or the most exciting thing that happened on the Cochrane River. So now that's an account. We went down the Churchill, we went up the Reindeer, we crossed Reindeer Lake, we went up the Cochrane. So now that's stage 4. Stage 5 is where we got into the really remote country. So to get to the headwaters of the final river, the Fluiasa, which flows up north and down to Hudson Bay, was a series of 10 portages. So portages, you're putting the boat on your head, you're walking anywhere from, in this case, about 2 miles to about 30 feet. So there was a series of portages that took me over the height of land. The trouble is, a previous fire, not this fire, but a previous fire had just nuked this entire area. And now it was regrowing. Fire in the north is normal. There are many species that are adapted to the fire in the north. You know, there's things like jack pine, which need a fire. The jack pine cones go in the ground, but they're covered in a thick wax. And it's not until the heat of a fire comes through that the wax melts, the cones pop open, and the seeds start to grow. They're adapted for fire. They can also make incredibly dense forests when they first come up. It's a billion seedlings all sprouting at once, all coming up, all racing for the sky. And so they're very, very tight together and very, very dense. And when that's over top of an old portage route that historically was kept clear by people traveling it, when people aren't traveling it anymore, that can become really difficult country to traverse. But it was also exciting in the sense that you're now really off the beaten path. Yes, people have been traveling this route for thousands of years, but in the last 100 years, not so much. And in the last 50 years, barely at all. It's traveled somewhat in the wintertime by Dene hunters, because now I was in Dene country, which is a different group of natives. They're still to be considered, I guess, Indian, but they're north of the Cree. And the Dene go everywhere on skidoos in the winter, snowmobiles. So you come across tracks, but it doesn't necessarily make sense from a canoeing perspective, because they are traveling this land in the winter in the snow, and they stay off the land for the most part in the summertime now. So it started becoming really remote, and I didn't see another person after this at all. So I traveled down the Fluiasa, which was a little tiny stream at first, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And I started passing many of the historical places that had been mentioned in the books I had done. There had been previous giant summer camps where the Dene would meet, but they don't meet anymore. They live in different places now. But just passing that and knowing that was there, I passed Casimir Portage, which was formerly kind of owned by sort of a chief, a prominent Dene local who set up camp there and would charge people admission and charge people a fee to traverse his portage. And his portage is the only way around this waterfall complex. If you go another way, you're going to be knee-deep in muskeg, just floundering in peat bog. It's going to be terrible. But if you went his route, where he had set up camp, it's not the worst portage. And now that portage has been kept open in part by snowmobiles and in part by caribou, because we're now in caribou country. And the caribou are wandering from lake to lake in the winter, but they also like to go on the high route. And if they're down in the trees in the summer, they want to be up high to avoid the bugs as best as they can, the black flies and mosquitoes. So the ridge that takes you around this waterfall complex is in high demand. So that was actually kind of cool because it had been kept clean or kept clear by caribou and skidoo, whereas in the old days it might have been kept clear by people portaging their boats and using a hatchet to clear the way. From there, I descended the Fluiaza to Newton Lake, which is this really beautiful lake. It's about 150 kilometers or 100 miles from the bottom to the top, but it is incredibly complicated. It looks like somebody took a giant can of paint and dropped it on a canvas because there are so many islands and so many channels and so many dead ends. And traveling there, you just get a tremendous sense of admiration for the native people and for the first explorers who went through there, because they didn't have maps. They just kind of knew, at best they knew, go in the lake at the bottom, come out the top. And that might be easy if you've got a nice oval lake. But what if you've got a lake that's built like a maze that you're trying to train rats in, or give them a reward if they make it from one end to the other? That's incredibly difficult to navigate, even with maps and even with a GPS. It's not easy at all. One of the things that happened, I guess the closest I came to screwing up, is on Newton Lake, there's a lodge. It's an old fly-in fishing lodge that a guy is now trying to rebuild. So what I say here might not be true in a year or two. It might be open again. And I'm not a fisherman. I know you are. I know many of your listeners are. And this would be an amazing, like lake trout, massive pike. I'm paddling on this lake, and you see this like welling up of the water, this giant dorsal fin, and is that a dolphin? Is that a killer whale? Oh, it's probably a pike. It's amazing. So I came to this lodge, and it's deserted. Years ago, they had a problem midsummer, and basically everyone packed up and went home. And so I wanted to explore it. I wanted to poke around. So I left my canoe at the water's edge and wandered up. I'm not going to go very far. I'm not going to go that far. I'm just going to look. I'll look on the ground. Oh yeah, there's a bear track here, but it looks really old. So I'm not that worried. Let's go check out this building. So I wandered up to these old cabins, which had mostly been torn to pieces by wolverines and by bears. And then I got to the main lodge. And I'm looking there, and I'm looking at the main lodge, and the doors have been kicked in. Who would do that? That's just malicious. Why would you leave these doors open? Animals are just going to get in there. And then I realized that I'm surrounded by about 30 piles of bear turd within 20 feet. And I hear a low growling coming from the inside of the lodge. Basically, a bear had moved in there. It was a special den. It was the nicest den that any bear's ever had, because he's got 4,000 square foot building built on a ridge overlooking a stunning portion of the lake, all to himself. And he's in there. He's not at all happy that somebody's coming to disturb him in his den. And I didn't have a gun. I didn't have my bear spray. That was so stupid. So I start retreating, and now I go a different way. I go a more direct route to my boat, and the whole area, the whole way is just fresh with very, very fresh bear tracks. So I somehow managed to find a way up to the lodge where there were no bear tracks at all. And then on the way back down to my boat, I'm not a tracker. I'm not a hunter. But when you can see a bear claw that's cutting razor sharp marks into the wet sand, and the sand is still wet, hasn't had a chance to dry, that bear was out there pretty recently, probably in the last half hour. So that could have gone badly. And it was a good reminder that I was now had crossed over from mainly black bear country into grizzly bear country, or tundra grizzly or brown bears. It's all the same species with some subspecies. But tundra grizzly are much grumpier than black bears. They're also much bigger and they're stronger, and they can really give you problems. So at that point, it was okay. Here's another thing that I can make no more mistakes about, because not only am I going to be dealing with brown bears from now on, grizzly bears, I'm also going to be ending up polar bear country eventually. And a black bear is omnivorous. It'll eat berries, it'll eat leaves, it'll eat meat, it'll eat carcasses, it'll eat garbage, it'll eat anything. Polar bears only eat meat, and mostly they eat seals. And seals are basically the size of humans, except we don't swim as well as seals do. So it was time to stop screwing around and get really serious about bears. And Newton Lake is, I don't want to play up the bear thing too much, because the real danger in Newton Lake is the wind and the waves. If you look at it statistically, not that many people die of bear attacks a year. Something like 3 to 5 people a year die of bear attacks in North America. That's 100 or maybe even 1,000 times less than the number of people who die from drowning and die from hypothermia. That's the real danger of being up there. Yeah, you've got to take the bear thing seriously. You got to deploy precautions, but you shouldn't get zeroed in on that, because the real danger, the real elephant in the room, so to speak, the elephant in the bear room is hypothermia and drowning. So Newton Lake is gigantic. It's amazing. The bottom part's in the forest, the top part's in the tundra. So as you head north, the trees get lower and lower and begin dropping out, and you start getting larger patches of tundra. And now you only see the occasional spruce tree nestled in a crack where it's a little bit more protected by the wind. So it's an amazing transition. You're on the same body of water, but you just watch the landscape around you change, because you paddled through from one ecosystem, from one biome to another. From the top of Newton Lake, I went down the Fluiaza River, and now this tiny little river that I had started on is a pretty damn big river. It's many thousands of cubic feet per second. And now the dangers of paddling become different. It's not so much getting pinned on a rock, it's running into gigantic waves, or going over a ledge and going into a reversal or a hole or a hydraulic, where if you think kind of a washing machine on its side, you would just go round and round and round and round in the roller at the bottom of the hole, maybe not even coming up to the surface. So you have to start watching out for a different set of hazards. At this point, the weather really took a turn for the worse. The weather was just horrendous. And the last 8 days of this trip, 6 days, were some of the worst weather I've ever experienced. Driving rain, heavy, heavy winds, just above freezing. Below freezing at night, but just above freezing during the days. That was the wind so strong that you're paddling downriver, down whitewater, but you're getting blown back up the rapids backwards. So now you're trying to navigate whitewater. That might be difficult, or it might not be that difficult, but it's made way more complicated by the fact that this wind is pushing you all around, and you're getting blown sideways into a rock you would never in a million years come close to hitting. And now you're seriously worrying about hitting this rock or going into some feature that you don't want to go into. And it really required focusing and also digging deep, because at this point, I'd lost about 15 pounds of weight. There was just no way I could eat enough. I had enough food, but I just couldn't force myself to eat enough. And my days were getting longer and longer, in part to stay warm, and in part because I knew that there was a terrible weather system coming. My wife was giving me updates. She's like, it looks like there's a really bad weather system coming in a couple of days. This is like towards the end. And that meant I would pull some epically long days, because I did not want to get down to Hudson Bay. And the last little bit of the journey, I had a pickup boat planned. A boat would meet me on Hudson Bay and take me about 40 miles north to the Inuit settlement of Arviat. Hudson Bay is a really dangerous place to paddle. And then we can talk about that if you like. But just as dangerous as paddling Hudson Bay would be sitting on the shore of Hudson Bay for 4 or 5 days waiting for a storm to pass, because it's the densest concentration of polar bears in the world. And I don't think people should get paranoid if they're going out in the bush. But if you're going to go and camp out in the area where all the polar bears sit for the entire summer, waiting for the sea ice to form again to go out and hunt seals, so they're on shore, for the most part they're starving or they're fasting, they will happily attack and eat any kind of meat that doesn't run very fast. And in the grand scheme of things, humans don't run very fast. So I didn't want to be there on the shore. So for the last couple of days, there were some 14-hour days on the water, just paddling. There were a couple of days there where I think I set foot on land once or twice because I was just in the boat. And so that was difficult. But at the same time, some of the most amazing things of the trip happened in those last couple of days. I caught the caribou migration. There was one day in particular where I woke up, the clouds had parted, there was blue sky for once, there was sunshine, there was a tailwind, not a strong tailwind, but a tailwind that was unheard of. And I got underway, and within the first couple of miles, I started coming across the caribou, and the caribou were coming from south to north. So they'd come in packs of 5, 10, 15, 20. They'd come, they'd stop at the water's edge, then they'd go into the water, they'd swim across the river, they'd go to the north shore of the river, shake themselves off, and gallop off across the tundra all day long. And that's just such an incredible experience to be part of and to witness and to think of the Inuit and Dene hunters for whom catching the caribou migration was not only the highlight of the year, but it was also critical. If you didn't catch the caribou, you were probably going to starve unless you got really lucky, because that harvest of caribou was food for the entire year. It was also clothing. It was also tools. They really did use almost every part of the caribou, the same way that the Plains Indians might have used every part of the buffalo. Right? The Plains Indians and their existence were tied to the presence of the buffalo, which is one reason that the government tried to exterminate the buffalo to get rid of the Indians. The Inuit and the Dene up in that region are inextricably tied to the caribou because it's a huge food source. It's the main clothing source. They'll use the horns and the bones for tools. And so being part of the caribou migration, even though I wasn't hunting them, I wasn't trying to spear them from my boat the way that they would have historically, it just allowed me to enter into that world a little bit more. And so for that one day, there were lots of good moments on the trip, but that day was magical and totally worth the suffering, all the suffering combined of the other 41 days. And so I remember at the end of the day telling myself, I have to remember every single aspect of this day. I have to burn it into my brain so that when I'm 80 years old, I can still remember this, because this is what it's all about. Eventually, I made it down to Hudson Bay. That was the weather just kept getting worse and worse after that caribou day. Made it down to Hudson Bay, and I was exhausted. My thermarest, my mattress had deflated, but it was not reparable. I couldn't fix it no matter how much tape and glue I used. So I was just sleeping on the ground, sleeping terribly, sleeping a few hours a night, paddling for 14 hours a day, not stopping, not nearly eating enough. And I remember getting to the meeting point that I agreed with the Inuit hunters. There were 2 Inuit hunters coming from Arvia to pick me up in the boat. And we were going to meet at a landmark at an old cabin. And I arrived at the old cabin, and then I got a message saying, yeah, the tide's too low. We can't make it in all the way. Meet us here. And it was another 4 miles out to sea. And that was a terrible moment for me. Like, oh my God, I'm so tired. And now I got to get in this boat and paddle it further. So I did. I headed out to sea. And that was quite something because it's a foggy day now. The wind stopped when I got to the bay. I don't know why. And you're paddling out. You can barely see a couple hundred yards. And you're paddling out into the open water, paddling towards some location on your GPS. And you're using a compass to navigate towards that spot. And you're just going, man, I hope that technology works. I hope this GPS is accurate. And it turns out it was. And they had waited there for me for several hours. And it was the two men from the town of Arviat. Never so glad to see anyone in my life. And they gave me a lift up to Arviat. And I spent the night there and then flew out in the morning. It's kind of funny because when I got into the hotel room, I just showered. I had not had a shower in 42 days. I'd been in the water, but I hadn't had a shower. I just tried to wash the filth off of me, and all my clothing smelled the way you would expect it to smell if you've been wearing it for 6-7 weeks in a row while working heavily, while sweating and bleeding and bug spraying it every day. So I went to the local store, and they didn't have much clothing. So I ended up with a set of like camouflage pajama pants that were made of a fleece and a sort of a 3/4 arm length t-shirt like you'd wear at a rock concert in the 1990s. And I had sort of shaved, but I'd had so much stubble that my razor blade had died before I was fully done shaving. So I got on the plane and I just had patches of hair. I was gaunt. Like I said, I'd lost a fair bit of weight. I'm wearing this bizarre assemblage of clothing. And when you take a flight, they give you your tickets for your baggage. This is for this bag. That is for that bag. And nobody ever checks. You just grab your bags and leave the airport. Well, this time the security guard came running. My wife was there waiting for me, looking splendid. I came off the airplane looking like a homeless person. And the security guard decided that I was a homeless person at the airport, just there to steal baggage. So it's the first time and only time in my life that I've had to show my baggage tags to pick up my bags. So that's the journey. And I mean, it was tough. It was difficult. Moments of it made me happy. But in the end, I decided that it wasn't really about happiness. That happiness is a fleeting thing. And that really what it was about was processing the brush with death and about satisfaction. Because I was satisfied as hell. I was fulfilled as hell. I had done something I'd wanted to do for a long time. I'd really pushed my limits almost to the maximum. And I'd come back alive. Right? The goal was to finish the trip without dying. That was the explicit mission statement of the trip, and I did. I survived the trip. And so I think it really helped refocus me on what's important, and as a reminder that life is short, and what are your priorities, and what do you really want to get out of this before you shuffle off this mortal coil, or equivalently become so old that you can't do things like that anymore. And so it was an amazing trip for myself. I found it super meaningful, and then eventually it turned into that book that we're probably going to talk about a little bit, Perseverance, Life and Death in the Subarctic. And writing that thing, it was good that I developed some perseverance and grit, because I tell you, writing that, and then rewriting it, and then rewriting it, and then rewriting it, rewriting it, polishing it until the turd became a diamond was a lot of work. But I think the development of grit and the development of, what do I have to do today? What's the next that I need to do? Why, what are the tricks I can use to keep pushing on when I'm completely exhausted? They're applicable anywhere. They're applicable to a canoe trip. They're applicable to, finishing your master's thesis. They're applicable to writing a book. They're applicable to powering through a project. They're applicable to doing your job when you've got 2 young kids, both of whom are sick and we're up all night. Ultimately, we just have to develop to the best of our ability, the ability to keep on pushing on. Because there's one thing for certain, parts of life are going to be tough, but it's also not going to stop for us, and we need to keep on going. How's that?
Wonderful. I loved it. So tell us, Stephan, what's the release date of your book?
It's March 4th.
March 4th.
It'll be out in hardcover format, audiobook. I just recorded that, and Kindle.
Okay. And the name of your book is?
And it should be available everywhere. It's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Indigo. Just for fun, I went and checked at a really small local bookstore that's around the corner. I went on their website, and it showed up there too. So they can get it in for me. And if that store can get it in for me, then your local bookstore can get it in for you as well.
Yeah, and you could pre-order the book. So I went online and looked on Amazon, and yeah, you can actually pre-order the book. So people out there, not quite sure where this podcast is going to drop yet as far as dates. But if the book isn't out yet, you can actually pre-order the book. And I guess I have a few questions about, not just about the book, but about your journey. So a lot of people struggle through life and have problems and not just physical health problems, but mental health problems. How can nature or a trip like this, or maybe the average person listening to this, how could they use nature or something like this to help them get through, hard times?
Well, I'm always leery about giving advice, right? I mean, that's one of the curses of the podcast world.
Yep.
That just because you're a podcaster or you're on a podcast, you now have to have an opinion on everything, and you have to be certain about that opinion. And it's actually a huge fallacy. But so speaking for myself,
yep,
and speaking for at least some percentage of people, I think to heal and to process difficult things requires time to turn inwards. And if you're running around like a chicken with your head cut off, or alternately, your phone is pinging you every 3 seconds with some super important announcement. Somebody liked a post that you did on Instagram. You better check it out. There's a message for you on the WhatsApp chat group that you're part of. Oh, look, your Discord server is pinging you, or whatever. There's an infinite amount of distraction. So I think the ability to create silence and solitude, at least for some people, is really important. I can't say that it'll work for everybody. And I can certainly say that my path isn't for everybody. I think there's an awful lot of background skills and knowledge and testing that you have to do and have to acquire before you do something crazy like a 1,000-mile solo canoe trip in the Arctic. There's the occasional Cheryl Strayed, who wrote that book Wild, and then I think it turned into a movie as well.
Yep.
Who hiked the Pacific Crest Trail with almost no previous experience. And that's crazy. I'm glad nothing bad happened to her. It would be insane if she had decided, I need to cure my life. I'm going to go climb Mount Everest solo because I know other people have done it. No. For Mount Everest solo, you need to actually develop the skills and the knowledge and the conditioning before you go, or you're going to die. That's pretty simple.
Yep.
I would venture a guess that if you try and head out and do the old route north, which is the ancient trade route that I followed, without any paddling experience, it's going to end very badly for you. Probably it's going to end up with your canoe wrapped around a rock, you sitting at the side of the river, and hopefully, best case scenario, you manage to call in a float plane somehow if you were smart enough to bring a satellite phone or a GPS communicator. And things can go badly really quickly. So I'm not recommending my path for everyone. But I think for a lot of people, finding a way to spend time alone, and for some percentage of those people, finding time to spend time alone moving through nature. So some people get a lot of benefit out of meditation and Vipassana retreats. I don't. I've never it worked for me, or it hasn't worked for me yet, perhaps is more accurate. But what works for me, what my meditation is, what my therapy is going out into nature, either with one really good friend or by myself, and having the time and the solitude and the lack of distraction to feel and to think and to process at some low level. By low, I mean not necessarily at the conscious level. For other people, it might be walking the Camino de Santiago in Europe. It might be heading out and going from pilgrim hostel to pilgrim hostel. And regardless of whether you're religious or not, it still gives you the time to walk, for 10 miles a day, 15 miles a day, you've got a place to sleep at the end of the day. You've got other people you can hang out with, but for 4 or 5 hours a day, most days, you're going to be alone, and you can be with your thoughts. You're going to create that room. So I think that's probably a good solution for some people, maybe a greater percentage of people than you might think at first. Maybe it's also an introvert versus extrovert thing. One definition of introvert is somebody who, when they're tired, they rejuvenate themselves by being alone. Whereas an extrovert rejuvenates themselves by being in the company of other people. So you can be socially competent, but an introvert, which I think I am. I think I'm fairly socially competent, but when I'm tired, when I'm run down, I definitely like to spend some time by myself with a book, listening to some music, sitting in a room by myself. That's how I recharge. So maybe I'm biased. Maybe this talk of creating space and silence and solitude is coming from that. I'm not sure. Again, I don't think there's one path for everybody, and I'm not going to make the mistake of advocating my path for everybody.
Is there anything else you want to add about the book? So your book is Perseverance, Life and Death in the Subarctic.
Yeah, if people want to check it out, it's gotten some really good reviews. Some people that I really respect have chimed in and said nice things about it. So that's a good sign. I promise there's it seems like everybody's got a book these days.
Yep.
And 2/3 of them are either ghost written. I'll pop people's balloon. Prince Harry didn't write the Prince Harry book.
No, he did not.
And we're getting to the point where ChatGPT can write you a whole bloody book, and then you too can be an author. Well, I promise there was no AI involved in this, other than maybe a grammar checking program, which I suppose is a super low level AI. And there was no ghostwriting involved in this. Now, just like you don't do a solo trip alone, truly, because there are people who support you. There's an infrastructure there to help you if things go wrong. And you're accompanied in spirit, if not in body, by the other people who've traveled that route before, who've wrote about that route before, who've told you what to watch out for, and the memories of your loved ones. You don't, not truly doing a solo trip alone. You also don't write a book alone, because you have friends and wives and editors and people who look at that thing and go, hey, paragraph 4 on this page makes no sense at all. And if they like you, if they're really honest with you, they will tell you the hard stuff. Like, the very first version of the book I wrote was mostly just a travel log. On day 1, this happened. On day 2, that happened. And a good friend of mine from jiu-jitsu actually said, this is interesting, but this could be so much better. So I know you've got more inside that head of yours. And we want to understand the whys and what was going on in your head. I'd somehow written a book about this trip without ever talking about why I did this trip. And that was kind of an oversight. And it's, you're biased. As a sort of a technical person, you want to tell the technical details of it. But really, for most people who are never going to do this trip, they don't need so much a trip guide as they do kind of a portrait of what's going on the inside as you're going through tough things, because everybody goes through tough things at some point.
Yep.
And so that's maybe more useful than, if you're planning on doing this route, sure, grab the book. You'll learn something about the portages and what not to do. Great. But hopefully it's got appeal beyond that, because everybody goes through tough times. Everybody's going to experience loss. At some point, everybody's going to experience a crisis of some type. And reading about how other people have dealt with these can be really useful. I know it's been useful for me.
Thank you, Stephan.
Well, thanks so much. It's such an interesting format that you have for this podcast, and it was a really interesting challenge to talk for an hour and not shut up and not be interrupted.
No, you did.
Thank you so much for providing this platform.
You're welcome. If you're looking for a powerful, gripping story of survival, I highly recommend Perseverance, Life and Death in the Subarctic by Stephan Kesting. This raw and inspirational account takes you on a journey from the brink of death to a renewed sense of adventure and hope. Stephan's lessons from the wilderness will leave you with the strength and courage to face your own challenges head on. You can grab a copy of the book on Amazon and check the link in the description. And as always, remember to stay safe out there and enjoy all that Mother Nature has to offer. If you like what you heard today, click the subscribe button to hear more upcoming stories. If you or someone you know have a survival story you'd like to share, contact me at isurvivethewildoutdoors@gmail.com.